Hello and welcome. Today we're going to dive into a really fascinating concept called lexical sovereignty. Now, what is that? It's the idea that a text can define its own terms and set up its own authority completely on its own without needing any outside sources. And we're going to break down an argument for how the Qur'an, specifically, is said to do exactly this.
But before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's just take a step back and ask a more universal question. How does any foundational text, whether it's legal, philosophical, or religious, make the claim that it's all you need? That it's sufficient all by itself? It's a question that really gets to the heart of how we interpret things. So the whole premise we're exploring today is that the Qur'an puts itself forward as a complete, totally closed system for law and for guidance. The perspective here argues that the book actually contains its own key for how to interpret it, and we're going to unpack that claim using nothing but the text's own internal logic. What's really interesting is the method used to do this. It's a principle called Tasreef, and what it means is you use the Qur'an to explain the Qur'an. So every term, every concept, every law gets its definition from how it's used somewhere else in the text. It's like it creates its own self-contained dictionary. This one single rule is the foundation for the entire argument we're about to walk through. And boom, this verse right here perfectly illustrates that foundation. It's a rhetorical question, right? The key claim is that the book is mufassal, or fully detailed. This self-description is basically the launching pad for the entire idea that looking for judgment or laws from any other source is, by the text's own definition, just not necessary. Okay, so let's see how this starts to build. A really central point in traditional Islamic law is the command to obey the messenger. Now, that's usually interpreted as following his sayings and actions, which are recorded in other texts, the Hadith. But this perspective challenges that idea by going back and re-examining how the messenger's role is defined inside the Qur'an itself.
So a huge piece of this argument comes from a specific rule in Arabic grammar. The Qur'an uses this structure called ma illa over and over again, which basically means nothing except, as in, nothing is upon the messenger except the clear delivery. The argument is that this isn't just a simple job description, it's a restrictive legal clause. It limits his divine mission to one single function: deliver the message. Anything else, well, that would fall outside his binding authority.
But wait a minute, what about that really famous verse, the one used all the time to support the authority of Hadith, the command to take whatever the messenger gives you? Well, according to this Tasreef analysis, if you look at the verses right before it, you'll see the topic is very specific. It's about fay, which is material resources or spoils of war. The argument is that this command is about the fair distribution of wealth, not a blank check to create new religious laws. Here's another key term, al-hikmah, or the wisdom, which often shows up right next to the book. Traditional views might say this wisdom refers to the Prophet's own traditions, but check out verse 1739. It gives us another clue. After listing a whole series of moral commandments, the text says, "That is from what your Lord has revealed to you of the wisdom." You see? This suggests that wisdom isn't some external source, but the actual moral logic that's baked into the verses themselves. Okay, so if the messenger's role is strictly to deliver the text, then what about the authority of scholars? The idea of consensus, or ijma, the belief that if most scholars agree on something, it can become religious law. Well, this perspective claims that the Qur'an actually sees this coming and systematically rejects the whole idea. This is pretty striking. There's this really consistent pattern that this viewpoint points out. Whenever the Qur'an talks about akthara al-nas, which means the majority of people, it's almost always in a negative light. They're described as not knowing or not being thankful or not believing. The argument here is that the text itself basically says that having the most people on your side isn't a sign of being right. It's actually a potential red flag for being wrong. And this quote, wow, it takes that critique a whole lot further. From this viewpoint, a lord is a lawgiver. So when scholars create rules that say you can't do something the text allows, or you have to do something the text doesn't mention, they're essentially taking on the role of a lawgiver. And following those man-made rules over the text is then framed as a kind of association, basically raising human authority to a divine level. So the critical point here is that this puts all the responsibility squarely back on the individual. The text says every single person will be asked about their own faculties, what they heard, what they saw, and what they thought. The implication is pretty clear. Just saying, hey, I was just following the scholars, or I was doing what everyone else is doing, well, that's not a valid defense. The burden of understanding is on you, the reader. All right, this leads us to a really practical objection. What about all the details? A lot of people argue the Qur'an must be incomplete because it doesn't spell out the exact mechanics of rituals, like how to do the daily prayer step by step. The source material offers a different take. What if that silence isn't a flaw, but a deliberate legal boundary? The explanation offered is this concept of the Millah of Abraham, or the way of Abraham. The idea is the Quran didn't just show up in a vacuum. It actually presents itself as a confirmation and a purification of a monotheistic tradition that was already there. This means things like prayer and pilgrimage were already known practices. The Quran's job wasn't to invent them from scratch, but to strip away all the human additions and get them back to their core purpose. This is a fantastic example of the whole argument in a nutshell. When the Quran is asked what to give for charity, it provides a principle: give all off, which means whatever is surplus to your needs. That's a dynamic, demanding ethical command. Contrast that with traditional jurisprudence, which often sets a fixed rule, like 2.5%. The source argues this is a perfect case of a human-made rule replacing a more demanding, God-given principle. The detail isn't missing. A different kind of detail is given. Okay, for our final section, let's get into the linguistic case. The word hadith itself just means a statement or a report. The argument here is that the Quran strategically uses this very word to claim that it is the only statement that matters. This verse is often presented as the cornerstone of the whole linguistic argument. It asks directly, after God and his verses, what hadith, what statement are you going to believe in? It's a rhetorical question, of course, and it frames the situation as a clear choice between God's statement, which is the Quran, and any other statement. In another verse, the Quran even calls itself the best hadith, basically claiming the title for itself. This illustrates a really critical distinction. The term sunnah, which is often translated as the way of the prophet, is apparently never actually attached to him in the Quran. Instead, it's used exclusively for the sunnah of Allah, God's unchanging way. The word that is used for the prophet is uswa, which means an excellent pattern of conduct. The argument is that his excellent pattern was in following the book, not in creating a separate source of law. So, to quickly recap the logic we've just walked through, it starts with the premise that the Quran claims it's complete. Then it redefines the messenger's role as being limited to just delivering the text. It dismisses the authority of a majority consensus. It frames any silence in the text as a deliberate choice. And that all leads to the conclusion that the Quran, by its own terms, sets itself up as the one and only criterion for truth. The ultimate implication of this whole line of reasoning is, well, it's profound. This perspective argues that the Quran's stated purpose is to resolve human differences. But by adopting all these various secondary sources, different hadith collections, different scholars, it created the very fragmentation the book was meant to end, with each sect rejoicing in what they have. And that leaves us with a final, crucial question to think about. If an argument like this, for a text's complete self-sufficiency, holds water, what then becomes the role of history, of community, of tradition? It's the central tension that this entire perspective forces us to confront. Thanks for joining me for this breakdown.